welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing to read Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. We are going to finish chapter 4 today. We left off yesterday with Harry explaining to Hagrid how he got to Knockturn Alley, and Harry asking Hagrid, well, what were you doing down there on Knockturn Alley? Because remember, Knockturn Alley seems to be an alley just dedicated to dark arts and the bad magic, if you will. And so Harry says, hey, what were you doing down there anyway? To which Hagrid says, I was looking for a flesh-eating slug repellent, growled Hagrid. They're ruining the school's cabbages. You're not on your own? I'm staying with the Weasleys, but we got separated, Harry explained. I've got to go find them. They've set off together down the street. How come you never wrote me back? Said Hagrid, as Harry jogged alongside him. He had to take 3 steps to every stride of Hagrid's with his enormous boots. Harry explained all about Dobby and the Dursleys. Lousy muggles, growled Hagrid. If I'd known. Harry, over here. Harry looked up and saw Hermione Granger standing at the top of the white flight of steps to Gringotts. She ran down to meet them, and her bushy brown hair flying behind her. What happened to your glasses? Hello, Hagrid. Oh, it's wonderful to see you two again. Are you coming to Gringotts, Harry? As soon as I find the Weasleys, said Harry. You won't have to wait too long, Hagrid said with a grin. Harry and Hermione looked around. Sprinting up the crowded streets were Ron, Fred, George, Percy, and Mr. Weasley. Harry, Mr. Weasley panted, we hoped you'd only gone one grade too far. He mopped his glistening bald patch. Molly's frantic. She's coming now. Where did you come out? Ron asked. Knockturn Alley, said Hagrid grimly. Excellent, said Fred and George together. We've never been allowed in, said Ron enviously. I should ruddy well think not, growled Hagrid. Mrs. Weasley came galloping into view, and her handbag swinging wildly on one hand, and Ginny just clinging onto the other. Oh, Harry, oh, my dear, you could have been anywhere. Gasping for breath, she pulled a large clothes brush out of her bag and began to sweep the soot that Hagrid hadn't managed to beat away. Mr. Weasley took Harry's glasses and gave them a tap of his wand and returned them, good as new. Well, gotta be off, said Hagrid, who was having his hand wrung by Mrs. Weasley. Knockturn Alley, if you hadn't found him, Hagrid, see you at Hogwarts. And he strode away, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the packed streets. Guess who I saw at Borgin and Burke's, Harry said to Ron and Hermione as they climbed the Gringotts steps. Malfoy and his father. Did Lucius Malfoy buy anything? Said Mr. Weasley sharply behind them. No, he was selling. So he's worried, said Mr. Weasley with a grim satisfaction. Oh, I'd love to get Lucius Malfoy on something. You be careful, Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley sharply as they bowed into the bank by a goblin at the door. That family's troubled. Don't go biting off more than you can chew. So, do you think you don't think I'm a match for Lucius Malfoy? Said Mr. Weasley indignantly. But he was distracted almost at once by the sight of Hermione's parents, who were standing nervously at the counter that ran all along the great marble hall, waiting for Hermione to introduce them. But you're muggles, said Mr. Weasley, delighted. We must have a drink. What's that you've got there? Oh, you're changing muggle money. Molly, look! And he pointed excitedly at the 10-pound note in Mr. Granger's hand. Meet you back here, Ron said to Hermione, as the Weasleys and Harry were led to their underground vaults by other Gringotts goblins. The vaults were reached by means of a small goblin-driven carts that sped along miniature tracks through the bank's underground tunnels. Harry enjoyed the breakneck journey down to the Weasley's vault, but felt dreadful, far worse than he had on Knockturn Alley when it was opened. There was a very small pile of silver sickles inside, and just one gold galleon. Mrs. Weasley felt right into the corners before sweeping the whole lot into her bags. Excuse me. Harry felt even worse when they reached his vault. He tried to block the contents from view as he hastily shoved handfuls of coins into a leather bag. So, what does that tell you about Harry's character? He feels bad when he sees the amount in the vault for the Weasleys, and then he hides his amount in his vault and quickly kind of tries to get the things that he needs and get out of there very quickly. What kind of a person does that tell us that Harry really is? So back on the marble steps, they all separated. Percy muttered vaguely about needing a new quill. Fred and George had spotted their friend from Hogwarts, Lee Jordan. Mrs. Weasley and Ginny were going to the second-hand robe shop, and Mr. Weasley was insisting on taking the Grangers off to the Leaky Cauldron for a drink. "Well, I'll meet at Flourish and Blott's in an hour to buy your school books," said Mrs. Weasley, setting off with Ginny. "And not one step down Knockturn Alley," she shouted at the twins, retreating back. Harry, Ron, and Hermione strolled off along the winding cobble street, up the bag of gold, silver, and bronze jangling cheerfully. In Harry's pocket was clamoring to be spent, so he bought 3 large strawberry and peanut butter ice creams, which they slurped happily as they wandered down the alley, examining the fascinating shop windows. Ron gazed longingly at the full set of Chudney Cannon robes in the windows of quality Quidditch supplies, until Hermione dragged them off to buy ink and parchment next door. In Gamble and Jape's Wizarding Joke Shop, they met Fred, George, and Lee Jordan, who were stocking up on Dr. Filibuster's fabulous wet start, no heat fireworks, and in a tiny junk shop full of broken wands, lopsided brass scales, and old cloaks covered in potion stains, they found Percy deeply immersed in the small and deeply boring book called Prefects Who Gained Power. He's always reading about this whole prefect thing. Percy takes his job very seriously. So, a study of Hogwarts prefects and their later careers, Ron read aloud on the back cover. "That sounds fascinating." "Go away," Percy snapped. Of course, he's very ambitious. Percy. He's got it all planned out. He wants to be Minister of Magic. Ron told Harry and Hermione in an undertone as they left Percy to it. An hour later, they headed for Flourish and Blott's. They were no means the only ones making their way into the bookshop. As they approached it, they saw to their surprise a large crowd jostling outside the door, trying to get in. The reason was proclaimed by a large banner stretched across the upper window. Gilderoy Lockhart will be signing copies of his autobiography, Magical Me, today, 12:30 p.m. to 4:30. "We can actually meet him?" squealed Hermione. "I mean, he's written almost the whole book list." And the crowd seemed to be made up mostly of witches Mrs. Weasley's age. A harassed-looking wizard stood at the door, saying calmly, "Please, ladies, don't push. There, mind the books now." Harry, Ron, and Hermione squeezed inside, and the long line wound right to the back of the shop, where Gilderoy Lockhart was signing his books. They each grabbed a copy of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2, and sneaked up the line to where the rest of the Weasleys were standing with Mr. and Mrs. Granger. "Oh, there you are. Good," said Mrs. Weasley. She sounded breathless and kept patting at her hair. "Well, we'll be able to see him in a minute." Gilderoy Lockhart came slowly into view, seated at the table, surrounded by large pictures of his own face, all winking and flashing dazzling white teeth at the crowd. The real Lockhart was wearing robes of forget-me-not blue that exactly matched his eyes. His pointed wizard hat was set at a jaunty angle on his wavy hair. A short, irritable-looking man was dancing around taking photographs with a large black camera that emitted puffs of purple smoke with every blinding flash. "Out of the way there," he snarled at Ron, moving back to get a better shot. "This is for the Daily Prophet." "Big deal," said Ron, rubbing his foot where the photographer had stepped on it. And Gilderoy Lockhart heard him. He looked up, he saw Ron, and then he saw Harry. He stared. Then he leapt to his feet and positively shouted, "It can't be Harry Potter!" And the crowd parted, and whispering excitedly, Lockhart dived forward. How alarming would that be? You're standing at a bookshop and all of a sudden the person that's there to talk is like running full speed at you and jumping at you. Like, back up, man. Just get my books. Anyway, he seized Harry's arm and pulled him to the front. Just yanks him, pulls him up to the front. The crowd burst into applause, and Harry's face burned as Lockhart shook his hand for the photographer. So if his face is burning, remember, we're talking probably not literally there, right? So if somebody's face is burning, it's because it's getting red, and red means embarrassed. So Lockhart is just mortally embarrassing Harry, and all the while, shaking his hand for this photographer. So the photographer's clicking away madly, wafting thick smoke over the Weasleys. "Nice big smile, Harry," said Lockhart through his own gleaming teeth. "Together, you and I are worth the hand." Harry could hardly feel his fingers. He tried to sidle back over to the Weasleys, but Lockhart threw an arm around his shoulders and clamped him tightly to his side. Like, "Stay with me, kid." "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, waving for it to be quiet. "What an extraordinary moment this is. The perfect moment for me to make a little announcement. I've been sitting on it for some time. When young Harry here stepped into Flourish and Blotts today, he only wanted to buy my autobiography, which I shall be happy to present to him now free of charge." And the crowd applauded again. "He had no idea," Lockhart continued, giving Harry a little shake that made his glasses slip to the end of his nose, "that he would shortly be getting much, much more than my book, Magical Me. He and his schoolmates will, in fact, be getting the real Magical Me. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have the great pleasure and pride in announcing that this September I will be taking up the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." The crowd cheered and clapped, and Harry found himself being presented with the entire works of Gilderoy Lockhart. Staggering slightly under their weight, he managed to make his way out of the limelight to the edge of the room, where Ginny was standing next to her cauldron. "Here, have these," Harry mumbled to her, and tipping the books into her cauldron. "I'll buy my own." "Bet you loved that, didn't you, Potter?" said a voice Harry had no trouble recognizing. He straightened up and found himself face to face with Draco Malfoy, who was wearing his usual sneer. "Famous Harry Potter," said Malfoy. "Can't even get into a bookshop without making front page." "Leave him alone. He didn't want all that," said Ginny. It was the first time that she had spoken in front of Harry. She was glaring at Malfoy. "Potter, you got yourself a girlfriend," drawled Malfoy. Ginny went scarlet as Ron and Hermione found their way over, both clutching stacks of Lockhart's books. "Oh, it's you," said Ron, looking at Malfoy, as if he were seeing something unpleasant on the sole of his shoe. "Bet you're surprised to see Harry here, huh?" Not as surprised as I am to see you in a shop, Weasley," retorted Malfoy. "I suppose your parents will have to go hungry for a month to pay for all of those." Ron went as red as Ginny. He dropped his books into the cauldron too and started toward Malfoy, which makes me wonder, how big is this cauldron anyway, after now having 2 stacks of books stacked inside of it? But Harry and Hermione grabbed at the back of his jacket. "Ron," said Mr. Weasley, struggling over with Fred and George. "What are you doing? It's too crowded in here. Let's go out." Well, said Arthur Weasley. It was Mr. Malfoy. He stood with his hand on Draco's shoulder, sneering in just the same way. Now there's 2 of them. "Lucius," said Mr. Weasley, nodding coldly. Busy time at the ministry, I hear," said Mr. Malfoy. "All those raids." "I hope they're paying you overtime." And he reached into Ginny's cauldron and extracted from amid the glossy Lockhart books a very old, very battered copy of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration. "Obviously not," Mr. Malfoy said. "Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace in the name of a wizard if they don't even pay you well for it?" Mr. Weasley flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. "We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name of wizard, Malfoy," he said. "Clearly," said Mr. Malfoy, his pale eyes straying to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching apprehensively. "The company you keep, Weasley. I thought your family could sink no lower." There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself on Mr. Malfoy, knocking him back into a bookshelf. Dozens of heavy spellbooks came thundering down on all their heads. There was a yell of, "Get him, Dad!" from Fred and George. Mrs. Weasley was shrieking, "No, Arthur, no!" And the crowd stampeded backwards, knocking more shelves over. "Gentlemen, please, please!" cried the assistant, then louder than all. "Break it up there, gents, break it up!" Hagrid was wading toward them through a sea of books. In an instant, he had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had a cut on his lip, and Mr. Malfoy had been hit in the eye by an encyclopedia of toadstools. I like that. He was still holding Ginny's old Transfiguration book, and he thrust it at her, his eyes glittering with malice. "Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you." And pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco and swept from the shop. "You should have ignored him, Arthur," said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet as he straightened his robes. "Rotten to the core. The whole family, everyone knows that. No Malfoy's worth listening to. Bad blood, that's what it is. Come on now, let's get out of here." The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them leaving, but he barely came up to Hagrid's waist and seemed to think better of it. They hurried up to the streets, and the Grangers shaking with fright, and Mrs. Weasley beside herself with fury. "A fine example to set for your children. Brawling in the public. What Gilderoy Lockhart must have thought." "He was pleased," said Fred. Didn't you hear him when we were leaving? He was asking the bloke from the Daily Prophet if he had been able to work the fight into his report. He said it was all publicity, but it was a subdued group that headed back to the fireside at the Leaky Cauldron, where Harry, the Weasleys, and all their shopping had to be traveled back to the burrow using Floo powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street on the other side. Mr. Weasley started to ask them how bus stops work, but stopped quickly as the look on Mrs. Weasley's face. Harry took off his glasses and put them safely in his pocket before helping himself to Floo powder. It definitely wasn't his favorite way of travel. All right, guys, that is it for today. I hope you all have enjoyed chapter 4. Do not forget that if you want to make it into the next video, all you have to do is submit in the comments section your summary of what happened at the end of chapter 4, and I will read it at the beginning of chapter 5. So you all have a wonderful day. I look forward to seeing many and talking to many of you soon. And stay safe and healthy, and I will see you in the next video. Have a great day. Bye, guys. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you all enjoyed